There existed a particular mathematics of desperation that reduced human dignity to numerical values, calculations that measured worth through capacity to resolve financial obligations, rather than acknowledging inherent value that transcended monetary assessment or social positioning determined by circumstances beyond individual control. For Mavia Silverbrook, this mathematics had become foundation of existence that threatened to consume everything she had preserved through years of systematic sacrifice, designed to protect family members whose welfare had been compromised through economic circumstances that challenged survival itself. 24 years old and carrying burdens that had been accumulated through generations of poor decisions and unfortunate circumstances that had shaped her family's understanding of appropriate survival strategies, she possessed dignity that operated beyond immediate material conditions, while maintaining hope that transcended current limitations to encompass possibilities that might emerge through choices that honored principles deeper than simple economic calculation or social expectation about appropriate behavior. The debt that had brought her to royal attention represented convergence of historical obligation and present necessity, financial arrangement that had been structured through compound interest and administrative complexity that transformed manageable burden into impossible mathematical progression that threatened not just individual circumstances, but family survival through systematic pressure that demanded resolution beyond normal capacity for economic recovery. 50,000 gold pieces had seemed manageable when her grandfather had secured financing for agricultural development that would enhance community welfare while providing foundation for generational prosperity, arrangement that honored optimism about future productivity over realistic assessment of environmental challenges and market factors that might affect agricultural success through stances beyond personal control or family planning. But agricultural failure combined with economic manipulation had transformed reasonable investment into crushing obligation that threatened family survival through systematic pressure designed to extract maximum return regardless of human cost or community impact that might result from enforcement procedures that honored legal authority over moral consideration about appropriate treatment of vulnerable populations whose circumstances demanded mercy rather than rigid application of financial terms. The compound structure of obligation had been designed to ensure payment through methods that prioritized creditor return over debtor survival, mathematical progression that guaranteed increasing burden regardless of individual effort, or family sacrifice that might be applied to resolution attempts, while enforcement procedures created additional pressure through systematic threat to personal safety and community standing. When traditional payment proved impossible through normal economic activity, alternative arrangements had been proposed that reduced human dignity to commodity value, while offering resolution that honored creditor preferences over debtor welfare through transactions that challenged fundamental assumptions about appropriate treatment of individuals whose circumstances had been compromised through economic pressure beyond their capacity to control or resolve. The proposal that had brought her to royal court represented final option for family protection, when all conventional approaches had proven inadequate for addressing obligation that exceeded their capacity for economic recovery, arrangement that would resolve mathematical impossibility through personal sacrifice that honored family welfare over individual dignity or personal preference about appropriate treatment and social positioning. Alpha King Theron Nightbane ruled territories that spanned continents according to principles that balanced political necessity with personal authority that had been shaped through systematic isolation from emotional attachments that might compromise decision-making capacity or strategic thinking required for effective governance of populations whose welfare depended on royal wisdom rather than personal preference or individual consideration that might interfere with broader objectives. His lack of heir represented political vulnerability that threatened territorial stability through succession, uncertainty, while providing opportunity for manipulation by rivals, whose objectives included destabilization of established order through systematic challenge to royal authority that operated beyond immediate threat to encompass longer-term strategic disadvantage in regional power arrangements that required clear inheritance patterns. The systematic cultivation of emotional distance that had preserved royal effectiveness through elimination of personal attachments had also created isolation that challenged fundamental human needs for connection and intimacy, while serving political objectives that prioritized kingdom stability over individual welfare or personal satisfaction that might compromise strategic decision-making capacity. tie during crisis that required clear thinking rather than emotional response. Years of ruling without mate had been interpreted as strength that transcended normal limitations, while demonstrating dedication to kingdom welfare that exceeded personal comfort, though such interpretation ignored human cost of systematic emotional suppression that might prove unsustainable when confronted by circumstances that required different approaches to leadership and community responsibility that honored both strategic necessity and individual worth. The arrangement that would resolve her family's impossible obligation while addressing royal succession requirements represented convergence of desperation and necessity that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate relationship between authority and service, obligation and choice, transaction and intimacy that might emerge when human mathematics encountered circumstances that operated beyond simple calculation to encompass complexity that honored both practical necessity and emotional reality. Tonight, mathematics would be tested against reality that operated beyond numerical assessment. Desperation would encounter authority that possessed capacity for choice rather than simple enforcement of terms. Obligation would confront possibility that human connection might transcend transactional arrangement to serve purposes that honored dignity alongside necessity through methods that balanced practical requirement with recognition of worth that operated beyond financial calculation. The Omega, who had learned to measure worth through family protection, would discover whether royal authority possessed humanity sufficient for recognizing value that transcended obligation, while the King, who had cultivated emotional distance, would encounter challenge to isolation that might prove more dangerous than any political threat through awakening of capacity for connection that operated beyond strategic necessity to encompass personal transformation that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and its relationship to human dignity. In royal chambers where political necessity would intersect with personal reality, transaction would be tested against possibility of authentic connection, obligation against choice, desperation against recognition that some values transcended monetary assessment to honor principles about appropriate treatment of individuals whose circumstances demanded mercy rather than rigid application of terms, that reduced human dignity to commodity status within systems that operated according to mathematical rather than moral calculation. Some debts created obligations that exceeded financial resolution to encompass recognition of worth that operated beyond circumstance, while some arrangements designed to serve political necessity might awaken capacity for connection that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and its relationship to isolation that had been cultivated for strategic purposes, but might prove inadequate when confronted by authentic human dignity that demanded recognition rather than simple utilization through transactional relationship. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. Alpha King, Theron. Nightbane ruled territories that spanned continents according to principles that balanced political necessity with personal authority that had been shaped through systematic isolation from emotional attachments that might compromise decision-making capacity or strategic thinking required for effective governance of populations whose welfare depended on royal wisdom rather than personal preference or individual consideration that might interfere with broader objectives. His lack of heir represented political vulnerability that threatened territorial stability through succession uncertainty, while providing opportunity for manipulation by rivals, whose objectives included destabilization of established order through systematic challenge to royal authority that operated beyond immediate threat to encompass longer-term strategic disadvantage in regional power arrangements that required clear inheritance patterns. The systematic cultivation of emotional distance that had preserved royal effectiveness through elimination of personal attachments had also created isolation that challenged fundamental human needs for connection and intimacy, while serving political objectives that prioritized kingdom stability over individual welfare or personal satisfaction that might compromise strategic decision-making capacity during crisis that required clear thinking rather than emotional response. Years of ruling without mate had been interpreted as strength that transcended normal limitations, while demonstrating dedication to kingdom welfare that exceeded personal comfort, though such interpretation ignored human cost of systematic emotional suppression that might prove unsustainable when confronted by circumstances that required different approaches to leadership and community responsibility. That honored both strategic necessity and individual worth. The arrangement that would resolve her family's impossible obligation while addressing royal succession requirements represented convergence of desperation and necessity that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate relationship between authority and service, obligation and choice, transaction and intimacy that might emerge when human mathematics encountered circumstances that operate beyond simple calculation to encompass complexity that honored both practical necessity and emotional reality. Tonight, mathematics would be tested against reality that operated beyond numerical assessment. Desperation would encounter authority that possessed capacity for choice rather than simple enforcement of terms. Obligation would confront possibility that human connection might transcend transactional arrangement to serve purposes that honored dignity alongside necessity through methods that balance practical requirement with recognition of worth that operated beyond financial calculation. The Omega, who had learned to measure worth through family protection, would discover whether royal authority possessed humanity sufficient for recognizing value that transcended obligation, while the King, who had cultivated emotional distance, would encounter challenge to isolation that might prove more dangerous than any political threat through awakening of capacity for connection that operated beyond strategic necessity to encompass personal transformation that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and its relationship to human dignity. In royal chambers where political necessity would intersect with personal reality, transaction would be tested against possibility of authentic connection, obligation against choice, desperation against recognition that some values transcended monetary assessment to honor principles about appropriate treatment of individuals whose circumstances demanded mercy rather than rigid application of term, as that reduced human dignity to commodity status within systems that operated according to mathematical rather than moral calculation. Some debts created obligations that exceeded financial resolution to encompass recognition of worth that operated beyond circumstance, while some arrangements designed to serve political necessity might awaken capacity for connection that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and its relationship to isolation that had been cultivated for strategic purposes, but might prove inadequate when confronted by authentic human dignity that demanded recognition rather than simple utilization through transactional relationship. The throne hall of the Lycan kingdom stretched before Mavia with architectural grandeur designed to overwhelm individual significance through scale that reinforced royal authority while providing backdrop for negotiations that would determine whether human dignity possessed value beyond mathematical calculation or would be reduced to commodity status within systems that operated according to financial rather than moral principles about appropriate treatment of vulnerable populations whose circumstances demanded consideration. Alpha King Theron Nightbane occupied throne carved from midnight obsidian that reflected light without offering warmth, his presence commanding attention through combination of physical authority and systematic cultivation of emotional distance that had been developed to serve political effectiveness, while eliminating personal attachments that might compromise strategic decision-making capacity acquired for governance of territories whose stability depended on clear thinking rather than emotional consideration. Around him, court advisors maintained positions that reflected careful balance between proximity necessary for consultation and distance required for appropriate deference to royal authority, their expressions revealing professional assessment of proceedings that would address both succession requirements and financial arrangement that served multiple political objectives through methods that established precedent while accommodating unusual circumstances. "The debt documentation," announced Chancellor William Greystone, with tone that mixed administrative efficiency with recognition of human cost involved in proceedings that reduced individual circumstances to numerical assessment, confirms total obligation of 53,412 gold pieces, including compound interest and administrative fees that have accumulated during payment default period. The precise mathematical assessment transformed family desperation into official record, while providing foundation for negotiation that would determine whether human dignity possessed value sufficient for resolving impossible financial obligation through arrangement that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate relationship between authority and service, obligation and choice. Mavia stood before assembled authority with composure that transcended immediate circumstances while maintaining dignity that operated beyond material conditions, though awareness of family vulnerability created tension that challenged her capacity for strategic thinking. when personal sacrifice represented only available option for protecting those whose welfare depended on resolution that honore to their survival over individual comfort. "Your Majesty," she said with voice that carried clearly despite emotional pressure that threatened to overwhelm strategic necessity, "my family's circumstances have made conventional payment impossible through economic activity that might otherwise provide resolution according to established terms and appropriate recognition of creditor rights within legal framework that governs such arrangement." The careful acknowledgement of limitation attempted to balance honesty about family incapacity with recognition of royal authority, while avoiding language that might suggest challenge to legitimate claims or inappropriate expectation of mercy that exceeded normal business arrangement, despite human costs that threatened survival through systematic pressure beyond their capacity to resolve. King Theron's attention focused entirely on her assessment with intensity that suggested evaluation extending beyond simple financial calculation to encompass personal characteristics that might influence arrangement designed to serve multiple purposes while addressing succession requirements that operated beyond immediate transaction to affect kingdom-wide stability and political security. "The alternative proposal," he said, with tone that carried weight of royal authority, while maintaining professional distance that prevented emotional consideration from compromising strategic assessment of opportunity that served both creditor satisfaction and political necessity, would resolve financial obligation while addressing succession requirements that serve kingdom stability through appropriate inheritance arrangement. Around the chamber, assembled advisors watched proceedings with expressions that revealed understanding of proposal's complexity, while recognizing political implications that extended beyond individual circumstances to encompass broader questions about royal succession and appropriate methods for addressing dynastic requirements when conventional approaches proved inadequate for current strategy. Needs. 1. Heir. King Theron continued with systematic presentation that reduced human intimacy to administrative requirement, conceived through arrangement that serves practical necessity while eliminating emotional complications that might compromise effectiveness or create expectations beyond transactional resolution of financial obligation and succession requirement that operates according to established precedent. Heir, the clinical description of intimate relationship as administrative function, revealed approach to governance that prioritized strategic necessity over human consideration, while maintaining emotional distance that preserved decision-making capacity, despite circumstances that might typically require personal investment or emotional acknowledgement of individual worth beyond utilitarian calculation. Following successful conception and delivery, he concluded with finality that transformed negotiation into decree about terms that would govern arrangement. Debt obligation will be eliminated while succession requirement receives resolution that serves kingdom stability without creating ongoing complications or expectations that might interfere with royal authority or political effectiveness. The systematic reduction of human relationship to administrative transaction challenged assumptions about appropriate recognition of dignity, while revealing royal philosophy that operated according to practical necessity rather than emotional consideration about individual worth or personal impact of arrangement that would affect multiple lives through consequences extending beyond immediate financial resolution. Mavea processed terms with understanding that transcended personal preference to encompass family necessity that demanded acceptance, despite personal costs that challenged her capacity for maintaining dignity within arrangement designed to serve royal convenience rather than individual welfare or appropriate recognition of human worth that operated beyond utilitarian assessment. "Your Majesty," she replied with steadiness that reflected decision-making processes that had been shaped through years of family sacrifice and strategic thinking that honored protection of others over personal comfort. "I accept proposed arrangement with gratitude for resolution that serves family protection while acknowledging royal authority and appropriate recognition of succession requirement. The acceptance carried weight of individual choice despite circumstances that limited options, while demonstrating understanding that family survival required personal sacrifice, that transcended comfort, to encompass systematic submission to arrangement that challenged dignity through reduction of intimacy to administrative function designed to serve political rather than personal objectives. King Theron's expression revealed satisfaction that mixed professional assessment with something approaching surprise at the grace with which she had processed terms that reduced human worth to commodity status, while his attention remained fixed on evaluation that seemed to extend beyond simple acceptance to encompass characteristics that might influence arrangement through personal qualities. It operated beyond administrative necessity. Chancellor Greystone will prepare documentation, he commanded with authority that transformed negotiation into administrative process, while maintaining distance that prevented emotional consideration from affecting strategic implementation of arrangement designed to serve multiple objectives through systematic approach to succession planning and financial resolution. Quarters will be provided according to appropriate standards, continued Royal Steward Marcus, with professional efficiency that honored practical necessity while avoiding acknowledgement of human cost involved in arrangement that would affect individual circumstances through methods designed to serve royal convenience rather than personal dignity or emotional welfare. As administrative details proceeded with coordination that demonstrated institutional capacity for managing unusual circumstances, Mavea found herself processing transformation from desperate debtor to royal arrangement through systematic reduction of identity to functional role that served political necessity, while eliminating personal consideration about appropriate treatment or individual worth, beyond utilitarian calculation. The evening that would fulfill arrangement approached with inevitability that challenged her capacity for maintaining emotional equilibrium, when intimate relationship had been reduced to administrative requirement that served royal convenience rather than human connection, while understanding that family protection required systematic submission to terms that honored political necessity over purs, all dignity or individual preference. In royal chambers that had been prepared for transaction rather than intimacy, arrangement would be tested against human reality that operated beyond administrative planning to encompass emotional complexity that might challenge systematic reduction of relationship to functional necessity designed to serve political objectives without accounting for personal impact that could exceed expected parameters. But as sunset approached with light that would soon give way to circumstances designed to resolve financial obligation through personal sacrifice, awareness developed that arrangement, which had been structured according to practical necessity, might encounter variables that operated beyond administrative control when human dignity confronted authority that possessed capacity for recognition rather than simple utilization of available resources. The mathematics of desperation that had brought her to royal attention would soon be tested against possibility that authentic worth transcended financial calculation, while emotional distance that preserved royal effectiveness might prove inadequate when confronted by individual dignity that demanded recognition rather than simple reduction to commodity status within systems that operated according to strategic rather than moral principles about appropriate treatment. In growing recognition that evening would determine whether transaction could contain human complexity or would be transformed through encounter with dignity that operated beyond circumstances. Both participants prepared for arrangement that would test assumptions about power and vulnerability, obligation and choice, necessity and possibility, that human connection might transcend systematic reducee. Tie-in to administrative function through recognition that honored worth beyond utilitarian assessment. The Omega, who had learned to measure value through family protection, would discover whether royal authority possessed humanity sufficient for acknowledging dignity that operated beyond obligation, while the king who had cultivated systematic isolation would encounter challenge to emotional distance that might prove more transformative than any political arrangement through awakening of capacity or recognition that honored individual worth rather than simple strategic necessity. The royal chambers had been prepared with efficiency that reflected administrative attention to practical necessity rather than emotional consideration. Furnishings arranged to serve functional requirements while maintaining appropriate dignity for proceedings that would address succession obligations through arrangement, designed to eliminate complications that might arise from excessive intimacy or personal attachment that could compromise strategic objectives. As evening deepened into night that would witness fulfillment of arrangement, Mavea found herself processing systematic transformation from individual with autonomous identity to instrument that would serve royal convenience through intimate relationship reduced to administrative requirement, while understanding that family protection required acceptance of terms that challenged personal dignity. Through systematic reduction of human worth to commodity status, the chambers themselves spoke of wealth that operated beyond normal understanding, while maintaining restraint that suggested royal preference for function over ostentatious display, environment designed to demonstrate authority, while providing appropriate setting for activities that served kingdom purposes, rather than personal satisfaction or individual pleasure that might complicate political effectiveness. King Theron entered with movements that demonstrated systematic cultivation of emotional control, his presence commanding attention through authority that had been shaped by years of governance, requiring strategic thinking over personal consideration, while his expression revealed professional assessment of situation that would address practical necessity through methods designed to eliminate emotional complications. "The arrangement proceeds according to established terms," he said, with tone that maintained administrative distance, while acknowledging individual presence, voice-carrying authority that had been developed to serve political effectiveness, rather than personal connection or emotional intimacy that might compromise decision-making capacity required for royal responsibility. His approach demonstrated systematic preparation for functional relationship that would serve succession requirements without creating expectations or emotional attachments that might interfere with governance responsibilities, while maintaining appropriate recognition of individual dignity despite circumstances that reduced human worth to utilitarian calculation within systems designed for polity, rather than personal purposes. But as proximity increased through physical necessity of arrangement, something unexpected occurred that challenged systematic emotional control through direct encounter with dignity that operated beyond circumstance, presence that commanded recognition, rather than simple utilization, according to administrative convenience or political requirement that had shaped original proposal. Her composure in circumstances designed to challenge personal worth revealed character that transcended immediate situation while maintaining grace that honored individual identity despite reduction to functional role, demonstration of strength that operated beyond compliance to encompass authentic dignity that demanded recognition rather than simple administrative processing. "Your family's protection," she said quietly, with voice that carried certainty despite circumstances that challenged personal comfort, "represents value sufficient for accepting arrangement that honors royal authority, while acknowledging practical necessity that governs current circumstances and appropriate resolution of obligations." The statement revealed thinking that transcended simple submission to encompass strategic understanding of situation while maintaining personal identity that operated beyond reduction to commodity status, recognition that family welfare required individual sacrifice, that honored protection of others over personal preference, about appropriate treatment or emotional consideration. King Theron found himself confronting response that challenged expectations about compliance and submission, encountering individual whose acceptance of terms demonstrated strength rather than weakness, while revealing character that operated beyond circumstances to honor principles that transcended immediate necessity, to encompass authentic dignity that commanded recognition. "You understand," he replied with tone that mixed professional assessment with something approaching uncertainty about individual whose presence challenged systematic emotional control through demonstration of worth that exceeded administrative calculation. "That arrangement serves practical necessity rather than personal preference or emotional consideration that might complicate political effectiveness. I understand," she confirmed with steadiness that honored truth while acknowledging complexity that extended beyond simple acceptance to encompass recognition of human cost involved in resolution that served multiple purposes through individual sacrifice that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate treatment and personal dignity. As physical proximity required by arrangement developed through systematic progression toward intimate fulfillment of succession requirements, both participants discovered that human connection operated beyond administrative planning to encompass emotional complexity that challenged reduction of relationship to functional necessity, designed to eliminate personal consideration or individual recognition. Her response to intimate contact revealed dignity that transcended circumstances, while demonstrating capacity for connection that honored human worth, despite arrangement that had been structured to eliminate emotional complications through systematic reduction of relationship to administrative requirement that served royal convenience rather than personal fulfillment or individual welfare. The systematic cultivation of emotional distance that had preserved royal effectiveness through elimination of personal attachments encountered challenge through direct experience of authentic dignity that operated beyond compliance to encompass recognition of worth that demanded acknowledgement, rather than simple utilization according to political convenience or strategic necessity. What had been designed as transaction began transformation into encounter that honored human connection, despite systematic attempts to reduce relationship to functional necessity, while intimate contact revealed capacity for recognition that challenged assumptions about appropriate emotional control and strategic distance that had been cultivated to serve governance responsibilities. Through hours that witnessed systematic dissolution of administrative boundaries that had been established to prevent emotional complications, both participants discovered that authentic intimacy operated beyond strategic planning to encompass human connection that honored individual worth, while serving purposes that transcended political necessity to embrace possibility of recognition, that opera Ted beyond utilitarian calculation. Her capacity for maintaining dignity despite circumstances that had been designed to challenge personal worth revealed character that commanded recognition rather than simple compliance, while his systematic cultivation of emotional control encountered challenge through direct experience of authenticity that operated beyond administrative convenience to honor human connection. The arrangement that had been structured according to practical necessity discovered variables that exceeded planning through encounter with dignity that demanded recognition rather than reduction to commodity status, while intimate contact revealed capacity for connection that transcended strategic objectives to encompass emotional reality that operated beyond administrative boundaries. As dawn approached with light that would mark completion of arrangement according to established terms, both participants found themselves processing experience that had challenged systematic assumptions about relationship between obligation and choice, necessity and possibility, transaction and authentic connection that honored individual worth beyond utilitarian assessment of functional utility. The systematic reduction of human intimacy to administrative requirement had encountered reality that operated beyond planning, through demonstration of dignity that commanded recognition rather than simple utilization, while emotional distance designed to preserve strategic effectiveness discovered challenge through authentic connection that honored human worth, despite circumstances that had been structured to eliminate personal consideration. King Theron found himself confronting transformation that exceeded expectation about functional relationship through encounter with individual whose presence challenged systematic emotional control while demonstrating capacity for connection that operated beyond administrative convenience to encompass recognition of worth that transcended political necessity to honor human dignity. "The arrangement," he said with voice that carried uncertainty rather than professional distance, tone revealing internal processing of experience that had challenged expectations about emotional control and strategic distance that had been cultivated to serve governance effectiveness, has been fulfilled according to established terms. But even as administrative language attempted to maintain systematic boundaries, awareness developed that experience had created consequences that exceeded planning through demonstration of authentic connection that honored human worth, while serving purposes that transcended strategic necessity to encompass emotional reality that operated beyond utilitarian calculation. The mathematics of desperation that had brought her to royal attention had been transformed through encounter with authority that possessed capacity for recognition rather than simple enforcement of terms, while systematic emotional isolation discovered challenge through authentic dignity that demanded acknowledgement beyond administrative convenience or political requirement that had shaped Origi. Null arrangement. In growing recognition that single night had created consequences that exceeded planning through demonstration of connection that honored individual worth beyond functional utility, both participants processed transformation that would affect understanding about appropriate relationship between power and vulnerability, obligation and choice, transaction and possibility of authentic recognition, that operated beyond systematic reduction to administrative necessity. The Omega, who had accepted arrangement to protect family welfare, had discovered that royal authority possessed humanity, sufficient for recognizing dignity, that operated beyond circumstances, while the king, who had cultivated systematic isolation, encountered challenge to emotional distance through authentic connection that honored individual worth rather than simple political convenience or strategic necessity that had governed original proposal. The night that had been designed to serve practical requirement through elimination of emotional complications had instead awakened recognition that operated beyond administrative boundaries to encompass human connection that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and its relationship to isolation, authority and its connection to authentic dignity that demanded acknowledgement rather than Utilitarian reduction to commodity status within systems designed for political convenience. The weeks that followed their encounter passed with systematic precision that reflected royal administrative efficiency, while beneath surface coordination of practical arrangements, both participants processed consequences of experience that had challenged fundamental assumptions about transaction versus connection, obligation versus recognition, political necessity versus human dignity, that OPA rated beyond strategic planning to encompass emotional complexity that exceeded original calculation. Mavia's integration into royal household proceeded according to protocols designed for temporary residence rather than permanent recognition, her status reflecting administrative classification that honored arrangement's functional purpose while avoiding acknowledgement that might create expectations beyond successful completion of succession requirements that governed original terms and appropria, to resolution of family obligation through personal sacrifice. The physician confirms conception has occurred according to expected timeline, announced Royal Steward Marcus with professional tone that reduced intimate consequence to administrative achievement, assessment that honored practical success while maintaining appropriate distance from human impact of arrangement that had served multiple political objectives through individual compliance with established terms. The medical confirmation transformed personal experience into official documentation while providing foundation for succession planning that would serve kingdom stability through heir production that had been achieved according to systematic approach to dynastic requirements, though such assessment failed to account for emotional consequences that exceeded administrative calculation. King Theron received information with expression that mixed satisfaction about political achievement, with something approaching uncertainty about individual, whose presence continued to challenge systematic emotional control, despite administrative completion of arrangement that should have eliminated ongoing complications through clear fulfillment of established obligations. Family debt resolution will proceed according to established terms, he confirmed with authority, that attempted to maintain professional distance while acknowledging successful completion of arrangement. Documentation will be prepared that eliminates financial obligation while providing appropriate recognition of compliance with succession requirements. The systematic approach to obligation resolution demonstrated royal commitment to honoring established agreements while maintaining administrative boundaries that preserved emotional distance from personal cost of arrangement, though awareness developed that experience had created connections that operated beyond planning through demonstration of authentic dignity that demanded recognition. Around royal court that continued normal operations despite unusual circumstances, awareness developed of transformation that exceeded typical administrative arrangement through individual whose presence commanded attention, despite status that officially reduced her significance to functional necessity that served political rather than personal objectives. Her conduct, observed Duchess Helena Ravencrest, with tone that mixed professional assessment with growing recognition of character that operated beyond circumstances, demonstrates grace that honors individual dignity, despite arrangement that challenges personal worth through systematic reduction to functional role within political system. Furthermore, continued Chancellor Greystone with momentum that indicated development of assessment beyond simple administrative efficiency, her integration has proceeded without complications that might arise from inappropriate expectations or emotional demands that could compromise royal effectiveness through personal attachment or individual consideration. The systematic evaluation of her behavior revealed court recognition that she possessed qualities that transcended compliance to encompass authentic dignity, that honored individual worth while serving arrangement requirements, demonstration of character that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate treatment of temporary residents, whose status reflected functional rather than persona. Significance. But even as administrative assessment honored successful completion of arrangement through individual compliance that served political objectives, King Theron found himself processing experience that had challenged systematic emotional control through encounter with authenticity that operated beyond strategic planning to encompass recognition of worth that transcended utilitarian calculation. Her presence during daily court proceedings commanded attention through dignity that operated beyond official status, while conversations that had been limited to administrative necessity revealed intelligence that honored strategic thinking alongside personal consideration about appropriate treatment of others whose circumstances demanded recognition rather than simple utilization. The Eastern Territories report successful harvest, she observed during routine briefing, that had included her participation, despite status that officially limited involvement in political discussion. Though distribution challenges might benefit from coordination that honors community welfare alongside economic efficiency that serves kingdom-wide prosperity. The contribution revealed understanding that extended beyond personal circumstances to encompass strategic thinking about territorial management and community welfare, demonstration of capability that operated beyond administrative role to honor comprehensive assessment of kingdom requirements and appropriate governance that served population welfare through balanced approaches. King Theron found himself responding with attention that exceeded normal courtesy for temporary residents, recognition that her perspective possessed value that transcended status, while serving strategic thinking that honored comprehensive assessment over traditional limitation about appropriate participation in governance discussion and political coordination. "Your assessment," he replied with tone that carried professional interest rather than simple acknowledgement of compliance, identifies considerations that merit investigation through administrative review and strategic evaluation of distribution arrangements that serve community welfare alongside economic objectives. The systematic engagement with her perspective revealed transformation from functional arrangement to recognition of individual capability that operated beyond original terms, while serving strategic thinking that honored comprehensive assessment of kingdom requirements, though such development challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate emotional distance. As pregnancy progressed according to medical expectations that confirmed successful completion of arrangement's primary objective, awareness developed that experience had created consequences that exceeded planning through demonstration of connection that honored human worth, while serving purposes that transcended political necessity to encompass emotional recognition that operated beyond administrative convenience. The heir's development proceeds according to optimal parameters, confirmed royal physician with professional assessment that transformed intimate consequence into medical achievement, while maternal health remains excellent despite stress factors that might typically compromise pregnancy outcomes during unusual circumstances that challenge normal support systems. The medical evaluation honored successful pregnancy, while acknowledging resilience that operated beyond expected parameters, demonstration of strength that served arrangement objectives, while revealing character that commanded recognition, rather than simple administrative processing according to established protocols for temporary residents whose status reflected functional rather than personal significance. But medical success created new questions about arrangement completion that would determine whether administrative boundaries could contain consequences of experience that had challenged systematic assumptions about transaction versus connection, obligation versus recognition, temporary arrangement versus possibility of permanent acknowledgement that honored individual worth beyond utilitarian call. Collation. King Theron found himself confronting choice between maintaining systematic emotional distance that preserved strategic effectiveness and acknowledging transformation that had occurred through encounter with authenticity that commanded recognition, rather than simple compliance with established terms designed to eliminate ongoing complications through clear administrative boundaries. "The arrangement," he said during private consultation, that addressed progression beyond original timeline, tone revealing internal struggle between administrative convenience and growing recognition of individual worth that operated beyond functional utility, requires evaluation of completion terms that govern ongoing relationship and appropriate recognition of individual status. "Your Majesty," she replied with understanding that honored both practical necessity and emotional reality that had emerged through shared experience. Arrangement was designed to serve specific objectives while maintaining appropriate boundaries that preserve royal effectiveness and political necessity that governs kingdom requirements. The diplomatic response attempted to acknowledge complexity while honoring original terms that had been established to eliminate emotional complications, though awareness existed that experience had created connections that operated beyond administrative boundaries to encompass recognition of worth that transcended utilitarian assessment. Around them, royal chambers that had witnessed transformation from transaction to authentic connection served as backdrop for decision that would determine whether systematic emotional distance could be maintained or would be challenged through acknowledgement that honored individual dignity, despite political convenience that might favor continued administrative boundaries. "The child," King Theron continued with momentum that indicated development toward recognition of consequences that exceeded original planning, represents success that honors arrangement while creating circumstances that might require different assessment of appropriate treatment and ongoing relationship that serves both individual welfare and kingdom stability. The systematic evaluation revealed awareness that successful arrangement had created variables that challenged original terms through demonstration of authentic connection that honored human worth, while serving purposes that transcended political necessity to encompass emotional recognition that operated beyond administrative convenience or strategic calculation about appropriate boundaries. In growing recognition that single arrangement had awakened capacity for connection, that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and isolation, authority and vulnerability, King Theron prepared for decision that would determine whether royal effectiveness required continued emotional distance or could accommodate recognition that honored individual worth while serving kingdom objectives. The rough, authentic rather than administrative relationship. The Omega, who had accepted arrangement to protect family welfare, was about to discover whether royal authority possessed courage sufficient for acknowledging transformation that transcended obligation, while the king, who had cultivated systematic isolation, faced choice between strategic convenience and authentic recognition that honored dignity, despite political risk that might challenge comforty. Blue assumptions about appropriate emotional control and effective governance. The mathematics of desperation that had initiated their encounter was about to be recalculated according to evidence that authentic worth transcended financial obligation, while systematic reduction of human connection to administrative necessity would be tested against possibility that recognition might serve purposes that honored both individual dignity and kingdom welfare through transformatio, and that challenged traditional assumptions about power and its relationship to authentic human connection. 3 years later, the royal nursery had been transformed from administrative necessity into sanctuary where love operated beyond political calculation. Chamber filled with laughter that spoke of authentic family connection rather than dynastic obligation, while sunlight streaming through tall windows illuminated scene that honored human dignity alongside royal responsibility through methods that balanced individual worth with kingdom welfare according to principles that transcended utilitarian assessment. Queen Mavia Nightbane stood beside ornate crib where Princess Elena slept peacefully, her presence representing transformation from desperate debtor to beloved sovereign that had challenged every assumption about worth and recognition within systems that had previously reduced human dignity to commodity status, while her elevation demonstrated that authentic value operated beyond circumstances to encompass character that commanded respect rather than simple administrative processing. The child, who had been conceived through arrangement designed to serve succession requirements while eliminating emotional complications, had instead become catalyst for transformation that honored love alongside duty, family connection alongside political responsibility, recognition that authentic strength emerged through vulnerability rather than systematic isolation that had previously characterized royal approach to governance and personal relationships. The agricultural reforms have exceeded all projections, she reported to King Theron with satisfaction, that reflected systematic implementation of policies that had emerged from individual perspective rather than administrative convenience, approaches that honored community welfare while maintaining territorial security through methods that balanced compassion with strategic necessity for kingdom-wide prosperity and stability. Debt forgiveness programs have reduced regional poverty by 37%. She continued with analysis that processed transformation through understanding that emerged from personal experience with economic desperation, while education initiatives have increased literacy rates throughout territories where previous policies had created systematic disadvantage through exclusion rather than opportunity. The comprehensive approach to governance had established foundations for prosperity that honored individual dignity while serving collective welfare through policies that balanced mercy with justice, recognition with responsibility, compassion with practical necessity for territorial security, and community protection that operated beyond administrative convenience to encompass authentic concern for population welfare. King Theron approached with expression that mixed royal satisfaction with personal devotion that had developed through systematic dissolution of emotional barriers that had previously served strategic effectiveness, while creating isolation that challenged fundamental human needs for connection and authentic relationship that honored individual worth alongside political responsibility. The Council has unanimously approved expansion of social welfare programs. he observed with tone that carried authority strengthened, rather than diminished by emotional connection, that had transformed understanding of effective leadership, particularly regarding support systems that prevent families from facing circumstances that require desperate choices between dignity and survival. Their conversation reflected partnership that had emerged through recognition rather than arrangement, collaboration that honored both individual perspective and royal authority, while serving kingdom objectives through authentic relationship that balanced personal connection with professional responsibility for territorial governance and community welfare that operated beyond systematic convenience. Around them, royal household operated according to principles that honored human dignity, alongside administrative efficiency, environment where staff members received recognition that reflected their contribution, rather than simple status within hierarchies that had previously reduced worth to inherited position or political connection, demonstration that authentic authority served protection rate, rather than domination through systematic intimidation. Princess Elena's development continues to exceed expectations, observed royal physician with professional satisfaction that honored individual achievement while acknowledging family context that had provided foundation for optimal growth through authentic connection rather than administrative arrangement, particularly regarding social awareness and emotional intelligence that suggests exception. Null capacity for leadership that honors both strength and compassion. The medical assessment revealed character development that reflected family environment where love operated alongside duty, where individual worth was recognized rather than reduced to functional utility, where authentic connection provided foundation for growth that honored human dignity, while serving preparation for future responsibilities that would require balance between authority and mercy. The succession protocols have been updated accordingly, continued Chancellor Greystone with administrative efficiency that honored practical necessity, while acknowledging transformation that had challenged traditional assumptions about appropriate relationship between personal connection and political effectiveness, establishing precedent that honors love alongside duty within royal family stir. Sure. The systematic revision of governance principles had created framework that balanced emotional authenticity with strategic necessity, recognition that effective leadership required human connection rather than systematic isolation, understanding that authentic authority emerged through service rather than domination that had previously characterized royal approach to territorial management and community responsibility. Throughout territories where royal influence extended beyond ceremonial recognition, to encompass practical protection of populations whose welfare depended on wise governance, communities had learned about transformation that honored recognition over utilization while maintaining appropriate standards for territorial security that served protection rather than conquest through systematic applicate. Ion of force or intimidation. The diplomatic response from allied kingdoms has been overwhelmingly positive. Queen Mavea noted with professional assessment that honored international recognition of policies that balance strength with mercy, particularly regarding approaches that demonstrate effective governance through compassion rather than systematic intimidation that creates resentment instead of genuine loyalty among populations whose welfare depends on royal wisdom. 7 territories have requested guidance about implementing similar social welfare programs. She continued with momentum that revealed broader implications of individual transformation that had inspired institutional changes, while their success suggests that authentic authority operates through recognition rather than fear, when circumstances require sustainable leadership that serves commune. Protection. The diplomatic achievement indicated that honesty about human dignity served political objectives more effectively than systematic reduction to commodity status, while international recognition provided validation for approaches that balanced governance necessity with ethical principles about appropriate treatment of populations whose circumstances demanded mercy rather than rigid application of administrative convenience. In growing twilight that settled over royal gardens where family walked together according to routine that honored personal connection alongside official responsibility, King Theron found himself reflecting on journey that had led from desperate arrangement through authentic recognition to transformation that challenged every assumption about power and its relationship to isolation versus connect. Ion that served both individual dignity and collective welfare. The debt that brought you here, he observed with tone that mixed gratitude with recognition of circumstances that had created opportunity for connection despite systematic barriers that had been designed to prevent emotional complications, was never really about money, was it? No, she replied, with understanding that had been developing throughout years when individual experience had inspired broader transformation. It was about worth, and whether human dignity could be measured through anything other than love and recognition that honors character rather than circumstance. Their conversation carried implications that extended beyond personal relationship to encompass fundamental questions about governance and appropriate relationship between authority and service, power and vulnerability, strategic necessity, and human connection that honored both individual worth and collective responsibility for community welfare. Around them, palace that had been transformed from space designed for systematic intimidation into environment that honored authentic connection while maintaining appropriate dignity, served as demonstration that effective authority operated through recognition rather than domination, service rather than conquest, love rather than fear, that might provide temporary compliance but failed to create sustainable loyalty. The mathematics were wrong, King Theron concluded with recognition that transcended administrative assessment to encompass understanding about authentic value that operated beyond calculation. Human worth cannot be reduced to numerical assessment when dignity operates according to principles that honor character rather than circumstance or financial obligation. In royal archives where their transformation would be preserved for future study, scholars would document methods that had balanced recognition with practical necessity while learning that authentic authority required vulnerability alongside strength, connection rather than isolation, service rather than domination that honored comprehensive assessment of leadership requirements and community responsibility. But in private moments when duty allowed expression of authentic connection that had emerged through shared experience and mutual recognition, they would remember chamber where systematic arrangement had been transformed through encounter with dignity that commanded recognition rather than simple utilization, love that had emerged through vulnerability rather than strategic planning or administrative convenience. The Omega, who had accepted arrangement to protect family welfare, had discovered that royal authority possessed humanity, sufficient for acknowledging transformation that transcended obligation, while the king, who had cultivated systematic isolation, had learned that authentic power required connection rather than distance, recognition rather than reduction to commodity status within systems that ignored strategic convenience over human dignity. Their story had begun with desperation disguised as administrative necessity, continued through recognition that challenged systematic assumptions about worth and relationship, and culminated in transformation that honored love alongside duty while establishing precedent about governance that served both individual dignity and collective welfare through authentic authority rather than intimidation. And the royal chambers where arrangement had been transformed into authentic connection now served as sanctuary where family thrived according to principles that honored human dignity while maintaining appropriate responsibility for territorial governance, demonstration that effective leadership required balance between strength and vulnerability, authority and service, strategic necessity and compass, science that operated beyond administrative convenience to encompass authentic concern for community welfare. Some debts created obligations that exceeded financial resolution to encompass recognition of worth that operated beyond circumstance, while some arrangements designed to serve political necessity awakened capacity for connection that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and its relationship to isolation, proving that authentic authority emerged through service rather than domination, rather than systematic intimidation that might provide temporary compliance but failed to honor human dignity that demanded recognition rather than reduction to commodity status within systems designed for strategic convenience. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.